Hey guys, Erpleeple here coming at you with another quick tip on how to correct phase problems in your mix and also to sort of dispel a myth. That myth that has sort of gone throughout the whole EDM community is this idea that you should not have any stereo information whatsoever in your low end. And there's a lot of people that will say you should do this kind of thing where you cut out all the side signal low, below 100 hertz on everything. I don't know, and people think that's what we do in mastering, which is totally way too drastic. I think, if I hear a problem in mastering, there's two things I might do. One is I might take a shelf and cut the sides with a shelf. That way I have more control. A high pass filter is incredibly drastic. The other is I might use in a special type of EQ called the dynamic EQ and set it up to trigger on the side signal when the side signal gets too intense, so it can handle those kinds of problems without completely thinning out a mix. So let's go right into it. Here I have a bass, and this bass does have a lot of problems. In fact, I took a serum patch that already had some problems, and I just sort of amplified it and made it worse and put it to audio. So let's give this a listen with no plugins on it. And that one's not too bad, but overall it has a lot of out of phase content. This is kind of the one in particular that has most of the problem. And it's a good thing to train your ears for, because out of phase content, when it's really out of phase, is incredibly disorienting and it eats up headroom in your mix. So it's good to fix. Again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go look up any of the other hundreds of YouTube videos that discuss and tell you what polarity is and what out of phase content is. Right now, we're just kind of getting into how to fix it. So if you don't know how to read a correlation meter, here's one at all the way at +1. That is completely in phase content. All the way at -1 is completely out of phase content, which would actually be pure silence if it was completely out of phase. And so typically stereo content can kind of sit in between +1 and 0, and that's kind of a good wide place to be. If you start getting down, if you dip down towards 0 every now and again, it's not too bad. But if you're dipping down into this negative range, you're kind of in trouble, and those are issues you need to fix. They're issues you should be able to hear, but if you don't have a good monitoring environment, it's good to know how to read one of these and use this kind of tool. So if we go ahead and listen here. Let's turn this on. I was looking at the wrong one. So if we look at this here, actually, I'm going to just show you what I did. So let's just start over here. So if we solo the low end band, there we can see on this one in particular, it dips all the way down to somewhere around -1. Now, some of these aren't so bad. If I play this one, it stays mostly in phase, even though it is pretty wide. And that's something to remember, is that stereo content does not mean out of phase content. You can have stereo content that's very wide sounding, that's completely in phase. So it's good to make the distinction. Now, if I play that, that's obviously a problem. What I was doing was I was sort of dipping down the width here. Because this is so much of a problem, I can't handle it only with this kind of a tool. Although even that's pretty good. Oh, that's because I'm on the one that's not a problem. So yeah, you can see there, even with this, it's sort of, even if I go down to like, there, it's not, it's kind of just barely good enough. Now, in this kind of a situation, I might need to use a few things. So here's another approach with the dynamic EQ. I'm going to turn this band off. And this is one kind of dynamic EQ. Isotope has one, and you can kind of put mid-side on. And here having to only listen to the side signal, and I have a low shelf here. So what's going to happen is it's going to cut the side signal when the side signal gets too intense, which I need to set a lower threshold. And you can see there it's starting to dip as it's a problem. Now, another tool could be, here's another one by Hoffa, another dynamic EQ. These things are great. Set up for the side signal. It's going to also dip when the side signal gets too intense. And I can kind of use a combination of all of these even if I want. But let me go ahead and put this imager at the end so I can kind of see the product of these. So you can see there, before it was dipping down pretty far, and here we kind of have it under control. It doesn't ever dip down. And because those dynamic EQs are working so well, I'm going to kind of reduce this so I'm not cutting as much on the width here. Maybe a little bit more than that. And there's, so that's very healthy. You know, I'm getting some good width out of the low end, and I'm not really creating any unmanageable phase problems. And so we can also hear that it also is a problem here in the mid-range. And that's very wide and disorienting. It's not as much of a problem here in the high mids or the high end, although these aren't great, but they're not bad. So we'll leave those as is, and we'll focus here on this sort of mid-range band. So I can kind of come back here. For instance, I already set it up on this EQ and turn back on this band. And you see the mids here are dipping when the side signal gets too heavy in them, as opposed to cutting them all the time. I'm dynamically cutting them. So I can maintain width as much as possible while dealing with phase problems. And I probably still need to cut it here. I do. And that's about good right there. So now I can unsolo that band and we can hear the whole thing. And we can hear with them off. Sort of just muddy and kind of flubby and not very punchy. Whereas that's very focused and punchy, so that kind of solves those problems. And it'll make sure you don't have any problems when you're playing on a system that uses stereo subs, because that really is where you'll have the most problem with this. And so here's an example of a song I was sort of sent, and this kind of was already corrected the mix, but where there's extreme stereo low end in the intro of the song. And right now I'm just soloing only this band, actually, so I got to take this adjustment off so you can tell, and that's incredibly disorienting. If you have headphones on, even it's almost hard to listen to. But if I pull this back, you'll see it kind of fixes it, or it seems like it fixes it, but it still doesn't sound great. And so it's always best to fix these problems, address them in the mix, find out what the setting is on that synthesizer that is making that happen, and correct it there. And just to kind of leave you guys with something, I'm releasing an EP with Chilled Records on February 23rd. Which is coming up in 4 weeks, and there's sort of a breakdown of that song where I think I used the concept of stereo low end pretty well, where I have stereo content that is completely in phase and sounds good. And so if we go ahead and just listen to it, it's sort of a sub drop with a pad glide with a white noise drop with lots of reverb. And if I solo just the low end, you can see that it stays perfectly correlated, but it's also pretty wide for low end. So, you know, that's sort of something to play around with, is achieving that sweet spot. Now, a lot of that is actually from the reverbs that are on the pads, and I'm not cutting the lows out in the reverb. I know that's kind of a common thing people do. They like to use high-pass filters on their reverb return channels, but I don't personally like to do that. I think that reverb is a great way to get some stereo content in your low end without it creating phase conflicts, and it can kind of make the low end to sound really rich and thick. So personally, I like that, but you know, play around with it and see what you like. I would just sort of advise against cutting all stereo content out of your lows, because it will sound very unnatural. There is the idea that we can only locate frequencies above 300 hertz in space, and that is incorrect. It's been disproven multiple times. We can locate frequencies all the way down to deep subnotes anywhere in a room. So stereo content is essential. And if you go to a movie theater and you hear big rumbling low end, that low end uh, it has a lot of stereo content in it. It's what gives us a sense of bigness. It's what makes a mix sound really big and thick and rich. And so it can certainly create problems, but those problems should be dealt with as you hear them. And there's not one technique that is going to solve your problem. Certainly no technique that will solve your problems and sound the best. You could cut all the stereo information out of your low end, and it would certainly solve any phase problems that might be down there. But you're also getting rid of a lot of good information that's helping your mix to sound really juicy. So definitely deal with your mix as you hear problems or find problems. Don't do anything the exact same way every time. That'd be my advice. And I hope you guys got something out of this. So tune in next week. I'll have another tutorial then. Cheers.